Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast, where together we dive into this week's Bible reading. Join us as we seek to understand the Word more fully so we can live by it more faithfully. Thank you for listening in. My name is Jerry Dreyer. I'm joined here today with Blaine Ashleman and Andy Schmidt. Producing the episode is Leah Bumgardner. This week we are reading three parables found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke: the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the bags of gold, and the sheep and goats. We will also be reading the story of Zacchaeus. We welcome you, listener, to dive in with us as we work to understand the parables Jesus taught. Let's begin with the parable of the 10 virgins. Andy, what was your initial reaction?
I don't know about you guys, but this parable always struck me as a little strange. Hard to understand, maybe. Jerry, what do you think?
I know Jesus is addressing the end times in this parable, but why would there be 10 virgins waiting for a bridegroom at night?
That was the part that always got me. I always wondered why there'd be 10 virgins waiting at night for the bridegroom. Read up on it a little bit, and it kind of made more sense. There's a lot of Jewish culture going on in this in this parable. A lot of the practices that we don't observe today, but there's a lot of them that are kind of similar. For instance, something that would be different than what we do today is a Jewish wedding in this time period usually lasts for days, a lot of times 7 days. So it went for a while. Something that was similar would be that brides would have bridesmaids. Now, we believe in this parable, the bridesmaids would actually be the virgins that we're talking about. So when we hear virgins, we're actually looking at bridesmaids. Now, these bridesmaids would all have certain responsibilities. For instance, keeping lamps lit and so on. These would all be tasks that they would have.
That is interesting, but I still don't know why they had lamps at night.
Right. Well, at this time period, the wedding would usually be held at the groom's house. So the brides and the bridesmaids would be at the bride's house waiting for the groom. The groom would spend the day preparing the wedding with his family. Now, there would be a lot of haggling going on over prices and things like this. It was kind of a different scenario than what we'd be used to. Wow. But they would prepare for the wedding. And a lot of times, it'd take till nighttime before they would actually have the wedding ready for the bride to come, at which point the groom and his groomsmen would go to the bride's house and to take the bride to the wedding. And this would be at night. There'd be music, there'd be dancing, a lot of things going on. Now, the lamps would be necessary for that trip from the bride's house to the groom's house. So these lamps were actually pretty small. If you actually saw a picture of one of these lamps, it would look more like a gravy boat. I mean, they're little. And poorer weddings would actually have torches. The torches, they believe, would probably go for about 15 minutes, and they would go out. So the bridesmaids actually had a lot of responsibility keeping things lit, to keep things moving forward. A lot of work.
That sounds like a lot of work. So what about the remainder of the parable? Why wouldn't the virgins with the oil share what they had?
Well, at first it sounds like they're almost stingy about the oil that they have. But the truth is, they know that it has to last for the entire procession, all the way from the bride's house to the groom's house. So they're actually being wise in the fact that they know if they give their oil to the foolish virgins, the oil would run out about halfway, leaving the procession totally ruined and dishonoring the bride and the groom.
What about the door bolting? Was it common for them to lock the door for 7 days while they had the wedding feast?
Actually, no, that was not a common practice as far as we know. Usually, the door would be left open for people to come and go throughout the celebration. And actually, 7 days, there'd be a lot of things to be done. But in this situation, we believe they're actually locking the door against the foolish virgins. The "I don't know you" line is actually an insult or a reprimand, saying basically disowning the foolish virgins or excommunicating them from the actual wedding, which wouldn't have been a common situation, but this would have been a situation where they really dishonored the bride and the groom. If you could imagine, if your really good friend had a very important part of their life and you had ruined it by being selfish or careless in some way, and that friend saying, "We're done." That's kind of what's going on in this picture here. The groom is saying, basically excommunicating them from the wedding.
That leaves a lot to think about.
It certainly does.
Now let's jump into the parable of the talents. Jerry, when you were reading this, what came to your mind?
It reminded me of Achan and Ai after the Battle of Jericho. When the walls came down at Jericho, Achan took gold and clothing and hid it in his tent. God had forbidden them to take anything, but he did. And So then God didn't go with the army when they went to Ai. They thought that would be an easy victory. It wasn't. They were defeated. 36 men were killed. And they were weeping and wanted to know what happened. And God revealed to them that they had to deal with the matter. Mm-hmm. So then Achan was stoned and everything was covered with rocks and cast away.
So that sounds quite a bit different than the actual parable. Why did this parable remind you of that? What was the correlation you found between the parable of the talents and what Achan did after the Battle of Jericho?
Achan wasn't responsible. He wasn't paying attention to God's commands. He just did what looked good to him.
Yeah.
And the third servant also was given only one talent. The others got more, but he still had a talent to do with something, to serve his Lord. And instead of dealing with that as he should have, he just buried it and ran away. When the Lord came back, he dug it up and tried to act like he was giving it back and everything was okay. And there was just total lack of responsibility.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I know when Jesus was speaking this parable, he just got done going over a discourse of the end times with his disciples. What do you think Jesus was trying to tell those disciples then?
I think Jesus wanted to tell them that they were supposed to serve him diligently. They were supposed to give prayerful consideration to it. They were supposed to use leadership authority, that he was giving them all of that to serve him. And he gives us authority too. We're parents, Sunday school teachers, people with a Christian witness. So we have authority and responsibility to serve God and also to love one another. That's the only way it's going to work, if we work together.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
As I was reading the parable of the talents in Matthew and Luke, it seems like there's several differences.
Yeah.
Blaine, you looked into this. What'd you find?
Yeah, so my personal belief is actually this was two different times that Jesus taught this same parable. As Jesus taught and as many rabbis taught in this time period, they actually did a lot of repetition. They taught the same thing, maybe one day, and then weeks later or weeks earlier, they would teach the same thing. Okay. One of the main reasons is there wasn't scribes just writing things down all the time. This was a way that people could remember and then write it down later. So, like I said, my personal belief is this is actually a different time that Jesus said it, so he said things a little differently, and that's the way they were recorded. There also could have been a difference in who the audience was at this time, too. It's not clear on who they are that Jesus is talking to in Luke's gospel. Granted, in Matthew's, we know that it's the disciples.
Okay, wow, so this could have been a different time.
Yeah.
But what about the differences in the story?
So Jesus often used quote-unquote present-day events to make his points. We read this about the Tower of Siloam and it falling down and the disciples talking to him about it. It really connects his listeners and his followers to discover an answer without being overtly told. He would tell them kind of a story similar to something they've already heard before or know about, and then there would be some differences that would kind of make them dig into it and figure things out about it. And this was a very common rabbinical concept back in the time, and Jesus was no different.
Jesus is such a great teacher. What present-day event would Jesus have been referring to?
So many people believe, and again, myself included, that Jesus was referring to the story of Herod Archelaus, or commonly known as Archelaus. So Archelaus was the son of Herod the Great, and this is actually the son that is referred to early on in the Gospels, that Joseph, when he came to return to Israel after, this would be Jesus' father, Joseph, return after he went to Egypt, he was still afraid to come all the way back into Israel because Herod's son was reigning. This is that son. So Archelaus, when his father died, Herod the Great, when he died, which happened to be in Jericho where this parable is being taught, when Herod the Great died, there was controversy over an unofficial will that he wrote. It was unofficial because the wills of that day, especially of kings like Herod the Great, had to be approved by the Caesar of the time, in this case, Caesar Augustus. So in this particular case, it was kind of a deathbed change, and so it never got approved by Caesar Augustus. But in the will, he willed Archelaus a good majority of the land that Herod the Great ruled. He had 3 sons, and most of it was supposed to go to Archelaus. And this was a last-minute change. And so there was lots of questions on if Archelaus should actually take over this land. And so what ended up happening is Archelaus, who was considered a nobleman, went to Rome to receive for himself a kingdom from Caesar. Now, if that sounds very familiar, that's exactly how Luke sets up his story or the parable of the talents that Jesus taught. And at that time, many Jews hated Archelaus because of some things that were going on that time, some murder and some other things, and he was not treating the Jews well. And they hated him, and so they sent a delegation after him, saying they didn't want him to rule over them. Again, very similar to how Jesus said the parable according to Luke. Now, when he was in Rome talking to Caesar and trying to receive for himself this kingdom, eventually, through a lot of argumentation, Caesar allowed this to happen.
Okay.
And when Archelaus came back in the 10th year of his reign, again, the Jews really disliked all the things he was doing. So eventually they sent enough delegation back to Caesar that Caesar eventually took away his power and kicked him out of the kingdom. Yeah.
Wow. That would have been big news, I'm sure. I'm sure everybody who knew about it and was talking about it. And it sounds similar to Luke 19's rendition, but there's nothing about the servants.
And that's a very good point. That's what the hearers would have heard, is that, wait a minute, here's the story I know, but it's different.
Okay.
And that's what they would have held on to and what they would have sought after. So really kind of the meaning of the parable lies with those servants.
Okay. So the conclusion Jerry had about Matthew's parable is also reinforced with this one.
Exactly.
But there is something else different. In Archelaus' story, the Jews were eventually able to dethrone him.
Yeah.
In Jesus' parable, they were not. So is Jesus also pointing to his kingdom having the final rule and judgment?
That would make sense with our last reading this week back in Matthew about the sheep and the goats.
Yeah. We've enjoyed digging into God's Word together, and we pray that all of us can continue to glorify God as we gain more knowledge of Him through these readings. Thanks for tuning in to the Biblecast this week.